Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. You might hear my dog in the background because she's here with me. Yeah, wherever you are in the world, welcome. Make sure to take a minute, just hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. There's always when I look at the analytics, there's always 50% of the people who watch these shows don't subscribe, which maybe that's because they hate what we're doing. But if you don't hate what we're doing, hit the subscribe button. Um, and yeah, share it on social media, share it on your Instagram or Twitter or whatever, and share it with others later if you think it's a meaningful conversation. So just thank you for everybody for watching, supporting the channel, and of course you can also support our work on Patreon if you would like to. Also put a link to the Samir project again in the show description for folks looking for ways to support people in Gaza, which is still very desperately needed. So please do that. So our guest, once again, is Dr. Lara Sheehi. This is our 12th conversation since October 7th of 2023. We have at least one, other than that, maybe more. And I'm not going to read the full bio, but it is in the show description. She's the co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, which won the Middle East Monitor's 2022 Palestine Book Award for Best Academic Book, and is the author of the forthcoming book, which we're going to ask her how that's coming because it's supposed to come out in 2025. From the Clinic to the Street, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures, from Pluto Press, and is the founding director of the Psychoanalysis and the Arab World Lab. Lara, welcome back. It's great to be in conversation with you again. It's been a long time. It's been since October 30th, which is primarily because of the flood in my basement, but not, also a lot of other things going on since then. But yeah, so there's a lot for us to talk about. It's good to be with you again.
Yeah, it's great to be. I couldn't believe it's been that long, honestly. I mean, you and I are in contact outside of this, but that's a really long time. But I do want to say, folks, support this amazing work. It's been a lifeline, honestly, and being in conversation with you and also listening to all the other comrades you have on has been central to kind of keeping me aligned and focused. So I appreciate your work always.
Thank you for that. I know that these conversations in particular, whenever we post that we're going to have another one, so many people reach out and are really thankful for your interventions and our discussions together. So that's great. Usha, I hope I pronounced your name right. Thank you for your support. And just good to see folks. Good to see you. Good to see you. Good morning. So I do want to give a couple quick shout outs. So shout out, of course, to all the young folks who've been organizing in Los Angeles around the anti-ICE protests. I haven't been able to spend as much time as I want kind of digging into those, and hopefully we can do a future episode on those. But just, always inspiring to see people taking action, especially against, all the repressive machinations of this regime and this, all of the regimes of this regime, all the versions of it. And then also I do want to shout out, so I am an alumni, for better or worse, mostly worse, of Bowdoin College. And they have started an encampment, and it's a small school. I mean, it was 1,600 kids when I was there. There would always be 200 of them who were off campus at any given time. So I think it's now up to 1,900, but it's probably 17, 16 that are on campus at any given time. And so it's in a small town. It's a liberal arts college. It has all the common good day and all of these things, which students are very aptly, utilizing, of saying you say you're for the common good. Genocide is not the common good. And so they have, when I was there, which was after my freshman year was 9/11. So that gives people, it dates me quite easily for folks. But it was a difficult space, I found, to really find a lot of folks who were opposed to U.S. imperialism. Obviously, that was a very specific kind of time frame, but you know, like the pushing for Kerry instead of Bush was, like, kind of the limit of the political advocacy that I mostly saw outside of some environmental stuff and things like that when I was there. So just shout out to the Bowdoin Students for Justice in Palestine chapter and for all the other students who are a part of that. Um, I'm gonna be, as the alumni, doing the calls and the emails that they're asking us to do, and also reaching out to, you know, um to people I went to school with when I was there that I, still keep good relationships with and asking them to do the same. And so, yeah, anyway, I just wanted to shout them out and also just say, like, they've taken a building, they've taken, and renamed a building. I'll pull it up in a minute. And, that's, like, right now, they're kinda setting the standard, I think, for this semester at least, we had a lot of stuff like this last spring, of course, with the student intifada, but, um, it's been I think, a tough year for a lot of students on campus organizing, and, my understanding is that the administration has sort of said, "Oh, yeah, we'll let you in on this meeting and do this and do that," and has just stonewalled them and given them excuses, and which is not surprising at all. Of course, there's people like billionaire Stan Druckenmiller who have a whole lot of influence in terms of, I'm sure, how they're thinking about their investments and so on. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that they haven't taken any meaningful steps to divest. But shout out to those students and, solidarity with them. And we'll be seeing for ways that we could support them as well. And, I hope that it leads to more student protest and organizing on campus again this spring. So.
Yeah, especially in this right now, in this moment, right? I mean, when it's never been more clear how much of a fascist police state there is, that students are saying we're still going. This is unacceptable on any means. So I love that. And it also speaks to any pessimistic leftists out there that, again, talk about these things as a fait accompli, or that somehow it was, even the student intifada was a failure and that nothing happened. It's like, no, these students are saying all the things you can do to try to contain us, to try and, put us off the scent, to make us afraid, it's just not going to work, because the commitment is political. It's not an individual process, which brings us back right to the first conversation we had in October 2023 about what these students were willing to wager, right? And it's wonderful, and so and inspiring, and we should take a page out of their book.
Yeah, and again, I mean, I was like, I didn't fully thread the needle on, I think, what I wanted to say too, but just that if it can be done on a small liberal arts college in a liberal state in a small town with 1,600-ish students on campus, and they can take a very large student center, then it can be done anywhere too. And I think that that's an important thing for people to remember too, in terms of getting fatalistic or whatever around this. And obviously, we'll be following it and seeing how it goes. But just shout out to those students for taking those risks and doing that stuff. So for sure.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So yeah, so since we talked last, there's like way too much that we could actually delve into. There's like 7 episodes probably worth of discussion. We'll talk on some things, but obviously we've had the election since we talked last. We've had the ceasefire in Lebanon. We've had Syria, falling, HTS taking Syria, who's now bombing forces in Lebanon. But yeah, we've had the ceasefire in Gaza, and obviously the prisoner exchanges and the return of so many residents in Gazans to the north. And then we've had this Trump inauguration and this slew of executive orders that have come out that have just been, basically throw everything evil at the wall and see what sticks, kind of. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's a lot to talk about. We're not going to get into all of that, but let's see. Let's start. You want to talk about the ceasefire and the prisoner exchanges and
Sure.
the flood of return and kind of, there's the realities on the ground in Gaza. There's obviously the realities of we call it a ceasefire in Lebanon. Obviously, Israel is not paying attention to any of these as if they have to actually cease firing.
Yeah.
Um, and sort of like what's going on with you with all of this?
It feels like there's a year in every day, right? Like
Yeah.
I think I saw somewhere somebody had posted, I think it was Mel actually that you had on around the fires, right, in LA, who said like it feels like there's like 70 days in January or something like that, and it really does feel like the time that passed, so much has happened. I am blown away. I mean, I watch these reunification videos of political prisoners being released, and that's really where my heart is, right? And the reason why is, I mean, you and I have had these conversations over and over again about the commodification of defeat and the ways in which we can remain sort of militantly clear on things and psychic militancy, and they can seem like abstractions. And then we had an episode where we did Basil al-Araj's 8 rules, right? And I think there's nothing that sort of positions us to see those rules in action than what we have seen since the quote unquote ceasefire. And I'm saying quote unquote ceasefire because we know that there have been infractions since day one. We know that they ramped up their violence right before things were supposed to happen. We know there were monkey wrenches that were thrown in right before. And all of this shouldn't come as a surprise to us. If we are tracking Zionism at its core and its structure, and we are tracking the ways in which fascists are beholden to spectacles, none of this should be surprising to us. And at the same time, based on all the conversations we've had, how do we discipline ourselves to attune to life and livability and Palestinian commitment to forging spaces of liberation despite all of this? And like remember, I think one of the last conversations we had were the ways in which like there were analysts, even leftist analysts or Arabs, sort of deciding on a future that hadn't even happened yet in Gaza, which included defeat. And here we are afterwards, seeing with our own eyes every lie that the Zionist entity told. That they had defeated certain places, that Hamas and the resistance was gone, that it's just Hamas that's fight. I mean, every single part. That is what I am focusing on right now. And that's not to the, exclusion of the horrific effects of violence. I think we're seeing that. And also I think it's actually really important. Like the horrific events of violence are sometimes the easiest things for us to see. But I'm actually more concerned with us being able to attune and go backwards and retroactively see the ways in which the Zionist machine and its psyops was working on people and wearing them down, such that seeing the sort of displays of power by the resistance, seeing how organized they continue to be, seeing the ways in which they are holding their ground and actually following through on the promises and the reasoning behind Tufan al-Aqsa. Let's remember the Tufan al-Aqsa, the demands of that were the release of political prisoners. And seeing now, after all this, and that they did not cede despite all of that, and all the ways in which, again, Zionist propaganda, imperial propaganda, all this destruction was a fucking lie. And I think us to, again, repeat that and come back to that over and over again, not only does justice to all the martyrs that were lost, right? And that people weren't allowed to grieve, and the dismemberment that happened and the dispossession it does justice to that. And it also reminds us that we cannot write a history that hasn't happened yet. And they're teaching us that, right? They're showing us all the ways in which those moments of defeat and all, that's precisely what we were trying to talk about. Is like, this is guerrilla warfare. You have to trust what's happening on the ground. And here they are showing us every step of the way. It's like, this is what we were talking about. And our demands remain the same. And it's about the dignity of our people, the release of our political prisoners, and the importance of the right of return. There's no compromise. And I'm blown away. There's no jadedness around this whatsoever. I'm blown away every single day.
I really appreciate all of that. I mean, it was like, I think there were moments, you know, when you had the ceasefire with Lebanon, when you had, you know, HTS, you know, take Syria, and, you know, whatever people feel about that. I don't want to get deep into that today, but like you know, you see Israel start to expand into it. You see them saying, hey, we don't have any beef with Israel, like, you know, and now of course we see them also attacking different you know, communities and groups within Lebanon. You know, it did feel very much like, oh, like this thing that we think of as the axis of resistance, like it may actually be really, you know, crumbling kind of at this point, or unable to like hold up these multiple support fronts that we saw, you know, amid you know, 15 months or so of the war. And you know, I think that it was in that context too, where, yeah, I think it was very easy for a lot of us to feel a little bit defeated,
Yeah.
or to feel like, you know, this, nothing good is going to come out of this. It's going to be a disaster, you know. And still, as you say, like then in that same moment, it's like, well, no, like the Palestinian resistance is still fighting like vigorously in the Gaza Strip, and Israel's getting tired of this, and you know, and they're losing a lot of soldiers, and you know, and you get in that context, you get this ceasefire agreement, you get the release, as you say, of all of these political prisoners, all of these also, you know, I mean, they're all political prisoners, obviously, but like you
Yes.
get ones that are like political leadership and people who have these amazing militant pasts, but also you get women and small children and stuff like this too. And I don't mean to like create dichotomies there too, because I know that some of those women and children are also very much part of the resistance for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But the anyway, it was just, yeah. So there's still this achievement happening from the Palestinian resistance, and then yeah, the every day of like all these people in Gaza returning to just rubble, you know, and yet still having that militant defiance. And you know, it's difficult. Like I don't want to romanticize that at all, because like my God, like having to survive 15 months of just the most vicious war crimes and genocide that we can, you know, think of in our lifetimes.
Yeah.
And you know, to return and to just be like looking among the rubble for either family members or, you know, artifacts or things like that of your family, like awful. I can't even put myself in that position to know anything about what that's like. But there is still this like very militant defiance
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to do that and to say we will return. And you know, I mean, I don't know if we want to go here next, but it is also to me why it's like when people get really fired up about Trump's plan, you know, to clear all of Gaza into Egypt and Jordan or whatever, and build them really nice places, and that they won't want to go back. You know, it's like, it's absurd. Like, do you actually think that these people who have fought against genocide for 15 months are just gonna all pack up and, you know, and you're gonna, I mean, like, there's so many reasons why that we should be uh, deeply skeptical of that idea. It doesn't make it any worse or any better that he's suggesting it, of course.
Right.
Um, but you know, I do think that it's like, yeah, don't bet against the people of Gaza of what they're gonna do right now.
Right. Right. Or the South in Lebanon, right? We saw also the same thing. the return to the South, and the people defiantly standing in front of tanks and making fun of soldiers and just being like, get the fuck off my land. This is my rightful place. And the same thing in Gaza. And I think this is the thing, is that you're right. I think when all these forces come together, and I do think that Syria was a pivotal moment, right? Where I think people were like, oh, fuck, the defeatism that was involved in that. While at the same time, I do think you and I sort of exchanged some text around like you watching prisoners being freed there. And like, how can you not be overjoyed for people who were at the, at the hands of a brutal regime, and at the same time kind of bracing yourself for what we understand. Nothing good comes out of empire, nothing good comes out of Zionism. Like those things can exist simultaneously, and we can sort of recognize where oppression happens and also not willfully sort of disregard or think that somehow, that there's magnanimity or altruism that comes from United States empire.
Yeah, I mean, that was a very difficult thing for all of those reasons,
Yeah.
because also those images were being mass produced and propagandized in a kind of specific way too, for that exact reason, that they do tug on your heartstrings, of course. Like everybody feels a certain way about, especially when you show certain types of prisoners, families and things like that. Like it's going to create this value, and again, like, yeah, that's a very complicated thing, of course, emotionally. And they know that that's like, oh, this works great to say, hey, we've liberated this country, basically, which
Yeah.
of course it's clearly not liberated, and there's plenty of prisoners now too that people are trying to get out, that are now prisoners of the new government, and yeah, so I mean, I don't, you never, as somebody, I mean, Abdul Jawad said this recently. He was like, you don't want to, we don't know exactly what's going to happen with Syria over time, of course. And so, but it's also definitely coming on the heels of what empire wanted for for the area, and it also opens up a space that we see where Israel is taking full advantage of it. And so it is, I think one way to look at it is it is a piece, maybe a very complicated piece for people, of this idea to sort of remake the region, right? And to try to create a region in which something like the axis of resistance cannot come to be, and so that's the challenge of it.
Absolutely. And which has been the plan for decades, right? And I think this is the thing. There's an entry point like Palestine and Gaza, and the genocide was an entry point to many people that also might not have lived through or been on the ground or recognized the constant pressures on Lebanon, on Palestine, on the region to live up to this like new Middle East that's been, whether that's a Trump fantasy or a Democratic, that's a fantasy of empire, is to reconfigure what this looks like and strategically block the ways in which these countries and the resistance that has come out of these countries for generations, not just now, have locked up in arms and recognized that the condition is the same. I mean, you and I have had this conversation, which is just like me as a Lebanese Arab refusing the disconnect, right, between our histories and what it means in the long history of struggle against empire in the region, and Zionism is an extension of that, of course, right? And I think you're right that the propaganda around this sort of localizes and sort of sequesters your response in a particular way, which, by the way, the irony is that after 15 months of watching this in Palestine, you're actually primed to be like, oh, wait, this is also an oppression. Let me think about it in this way, right? Which that impulse is not what's wrong. I think the part about militant, psychic militancy and psychic clarity, militant clarity, is for us to be able to hold these things simultaneously, hand by hand, and be able to say, yes, of course, we are here to disrupt, the sort of the rotten regimes that create this, and also understand how that came into being, and to not compromise on what our vision for liberation is just based on that alone. And that is a skill. That's where we go back to, we've talked about duty before. Our wajib is to actually remain committed to that structural analysis constantly, despite all of that. And I think this is what we owe people, whether it's owe people in Syria, or owe people in Lebanon, or owe people in Palestine, is for us to constantly be working against these contradictions, to antagonize them, to be able to name them, and remain aligned internally, right? Where we're not collapsing because this, and that's the thing, when I see these political prisoners being released and I track their words and what they're saying, there's such a humbling process to be like, any fucking moment in which I felt anything that wasn't, it was like, it's just a recommitment and a sort of, really a space of like, okay, this is what it means to remain politically aligned. And if you realize some of the words that people are saying, and I wish in these moments, I wish everyone kind of understood Arabic, because there's a texture of it that can't be communicated. Let me take that back. I actually don't wish everybody understood Arabic. Sometimes it's okay to be opaque and let that be there. But my point is, the texture that's being communicated is really important. And this is the point of like holding both in mind, the simultaneous worlds that are being experienced and are happening. These political prisoners are not coming out and being like, wow, that was the easiest thing ever because we're politically aligned. They're telling us, some people saying, if I explained to you for 2 years straight how bad the conditions were, I still couldn't communicate to you how awful being in Zionist prisons was. And also, that's precisely why we held on to dreaming. That's precisely why we knew that the resistance we did. That's why we understand that the only reason we saw freedom was because of these sacrifices that were made. That's why all of them come out and thank Gaza and thank Palestinians and remember. And like that practice of coming back to the condition and precondition, like we've talked about before, when you're being released, recognizing both the violence has been done to you and also naming and acknowledging and recognizing the things that are not meant to be recognized. Remember, we had to, right when the deals were cut, there was a sort of like, you're not allowed to feel joy. You're not allowed to celebrate. We know that across the West Bank, for example, Zionist forces are coming in to homes of people who are being released and threatening them and sometimes kidnapping them, right? Even if it's for a day or two, to intimidate them, to say you're not allowed to show any signs of joy, right? You're not allowed to celebrate this because that is going to be, state as though you're celebrating terrorism or whatever the state is going to, dictate, which is the same thing that's happening in the settler colony of the United States, by the way, right? Saying like, you're not allowed to sort of support Palestinian resistance because that's you supporting terrorism. It's the same logic over and over and over and over and over again. And I think this is part of what we have to recognize. Again, the logic repeating itself, but take a cue, right? And say, okay, even if we look back and we say there were moments where we lost hope, there were moments when it felt like we were defeated, there were moments when we were lost in the abyss of, terror around what was going to happen, that if nothing else, now looking at this is listening and being attuned and going backwards and revising and getting ready for the next time around, because we cannot continue to be surprised every time this happens. We know this is just like you're saying. And if there's an imperial plan, right, for a new Middle East, what does that demand of us then? A reconfiguration of the way we're imagining what our strategies are as a global leftist, sort of internationalist campaign around these sorts of things. What does it mean psychoaffectively, right, around to be attentive to this? What do we have to commit to? And what do we have to divest from, right? Divesting from the ideas of like, who's going to be by our side, who's supporting us, we have to reconfigure all of that. If this is a quote unquote new age, then it's an invitation also for us to be like, what is it that we have to also be thinking about in this way? The last thing I'll say is to your point of like Trump sort of saying these things, I want us to also think about the ways that how colonizers, like the process and the commitment to colonization, whether it's in the settler colony of the United States or or the settler state of Israel, lacks creativity and like this, the sort of idea of like, yeah, let's just ethnically cleanse people and say it out loud. And let's not forget also that it was Biden and Blinken that started this to begin with. That at the beginning of the genocide, Blinken went around the entire Middle East and split the exact same plan, right? So all of a sudden we're registering it that this fascist, because he's a fascist and he's all about the spectacle and about saying it and owning all of the fascism, right? This is the point of like going back to it and saying that the colonizer cannot even imagine, right, that people in Gaza are returning to the rubble, like you're saying, or people in Lebanon in the south are returning to that and saying, we're going to rebuild it and we'll do this. And I don't give a fuck. I'm going to put a tent on top of my rubble and I'm going to sit here because this is my land. This is my home. To hear then people just callously be like, oh yeah, we'll just get them and we'll build them new houses. That's a confessional also about the only things they give a fuck about. They cannot imagine a connection to the land. That needs to be the space that we exploit, right? That is the tension where we're like, your statements, rather than get bogged down in the content and then just be like, oh my God, yes, of course they're talking about ethnic cleansing. That's what Zionism is. That's what genocidal warfare is. That's what the United States is built on. Why are we surprised? But instead, we have to look at the limitations and understand that as a confession about why you will never have this land, because you do not understand what it means to be positioned and rather sit on top of rubble than leave your land, right? I find that so important and politically moving and grounding, and I think we should constantly return to that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, could you imagine Donald Trump trying to return to anything? You know, like, I mean, this is a man who's been pampered to the utmost degree his entire life, and you know, yeah. I mean, there's nothing in his makeup, in his, you know, there's nothing, there's none of that. There's not an ounce of that.
No.
You know, and there's not an ounce of that for the Zionists either, you know, which is also why it's much less talked about. They're having to figure out where are all these people who are living in the north gonna go, because they're not comfortable going back to the north in the same way with the same commitment as, you know, people are going to the south of Lebanon or to the north in Gaza.
Yep.
You know, it's not the same commitment to the land at all.
No, and no fantasy is going to make it that way, right? And Zionism is a fantasy and a sort of enactment of a fantasy, and we're seeing all of the limitations of that, because when you don't have an actual connection to the land as an indigenous person, you can sort of consider, oh, let me just go over here, or you make a fix for it, or get rid of these people so that I can sit there. And I do think that for us to constantly push up against this, right, and to highlight that and to focus on that is actually really important. And we see the ways in which Zionists become undone when you go after those contradictions, right? And that's, I think, upon us to constantly be pushing up against this and highlighting it. I mean, you see, they can't, I saw this everywhere, of course, when the ceasefire happened, everybody was like, you know, bring them home. And then all of a sudden, when the actual reality of what it meant, they were just like, oh, forget about them. This actually means we have to confront something. And that means that we have to sort of consider that there will be political prisoners that are freed, Palestinian political prisoners that are freed. And what does that actually mean? And that shows us it. And then also the gag order on their prisoners of war, right? The gag order around that. And and I think there's something really important for us, that also seeing the ways in which they can't handle the imagery that is being produced by the resistance, showing the ways in which their prisoners of war have been treated with respect and dignity, and then all the ways in which, like, they're sending them home with goodie bags, and all the ways in which the massive disconnect, it's telling on itself. There isn't actually much, right? Exactly. There isn't much we have to do. And I think that's okay. I think we can just sort of position these things and be like, this tells on itself, and then the entire machinery that is behind it to create a narrative that disrupts the reality in which we are seeing with our very own eyes is the same thing that has been acting upon us. This is the psyops part for 15 plus months of genocide, in which an entire machinery of propaganda and mainstream media and all that trying to tell us that what we're seeing is not what we're seeing, and trying to sell us the lie that there were actual victories. And everything we are seeing is in exact opposition to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right. Well, you had a recent win. Do you want to? I think we should tell a little bit of this story, because you've been like dealing with all kinds of, complaints, investigations, so on for a couple of years now, and I saw a statement about you winning that. So yeah, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And I think maybe this ties into it. This ties into what we were talking about, right? And what I'll say is that it often doesn't bounce this way, right? Where like you have the truth actually rising to the top and it coming out, but it did, right? So I think some folks might know this, that Stand With Us, the horrible pro-Zionist sort of Israeli, think tank group, whatever we call them, lawfare. I mean, they do everything. They're just like hand in hand with the Zionist state. Had filed a complaint against my former employer, George Washington University, in January 2023. And they had released it. The important piece of this is they had released it to the right-wing press the day before they actually filed it with the Department of Education. And the important part of that is also that they redacted everybody's name except mine in it, which is obvious what they were trying to do. And of course, it did what they were hoping to do. Not all these cases, they've done this before. Not all cases happen this way. But in my case, it did happen to sort of grow, and Fox News picked it up. And then there was an entire smear campaign against me. And my university at the time decided to preempt the Department of Education, which is the only body that can adjudicate these claims, right? It's a Title VI complaint, which is, by the way, against the university, not against a person, right? And I think this is where people get, because my name was redacted, everybody's like, this is a complaint against you, which we can see the racism involved in that. And of course, they wanted to put me at the center of that. But it's actually a really important piece to show the speciousness of it, is that actually anybody can file a Title VI complaint against a university. But the fact that they redacted my name and made this about me shows us what the political intent was, right? To collapse these two things and make it sort of seem that I was discriminating against what they said Israeli and Jewish students by engaging, and their word was erasive anti-Semitism, meaning that by virtue of my position as an anti-Zionist, that I am denying Jewish and Israeli students the right to identify as Zionists. And that was really the centerpiece of the claim. Obviously, this is a specious position that Stand With Us and all these Zionist organizations are trying to push, that just by merely taking up a position of anti-Zionism, we're seeing the end point of that, right? Is that if you claim yourself to be an anti-Zionist, that alone is enough to sort of shut down people's ability to conflate Judaism with Zionism. My university preempted the Department of Education, hired an external investigator. That external investigation completely cleared me of any of the specious allegations. That was March 27th, 2023. And then April 4th, I believe, 2023, the Department of Education sent out an alert saying they will be opening up the investigation and sort of giving it air. It took 2 years, but I just last week learned that the Department of Education had concluded its investigation and had found not only that there was no evidence to support the specious claims that I had discriminated against Jewish students or retaliated against them, but that in fact it was an entire fabrication, that everything in evidence that they hold evidence of, including the investigation, the third-party investigation, which my former employer actually never released the full investigation. They just released a summary and had left out actual key statements by that investigation that said, we find no evidence that Dr. Sheehi had engaged in any retaliatory behavior against Jewish students, that it did not rise to the level of harassment. I mean, every single claim that was made was completely found to be specious and fabricated. And also the conflation of, like, Stand With Us had made this whole big thing about my tweets and my political tweets, and that in and of itself positioned students not be able to learn from me because they had discovered that I was an anti-Zionist, as though that was never, known before. An investigation actually showed that none of the students that were in the class had actually any knowledge of my tweets before Stand With Us actually made them public. So also,
yeah, I mean, your Twitter presence was fairly, like, I mean, you were locked for a lot of it. I mean, it was fairly, like, private and pseudonymous, I guess I would
yeah,
say.
yeah, yeah. And I didn't have a large fault. I mean, this wasn't what it was about, right?
Right.
But that you can see what the forces were like to construct a narrative around this from such, sort of rickety evidence. You have to make something sensational, right? And so you and I have talked about this before, that, like, rallying all these forces to be like, I swear too much, or that I call all Zionists psychotic, or that I, my Canary Mission page has, anti-Zionism, BDS, anti-cop, anti-America, right?
Congratulations. That's just a beautiful resume. So
Right. I'm just like, okay. And yeah, you're right. Actually, that's my scholarship and exactly what I talk about. And my political positions happen to be anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-cop, anti-carceral, and anti-Zionist, because the structure of all these things shares in racism and sort of racial capitalism, and in exploitation and domination and supremacy. So of course I would be, quote unquote, anti all these things. But the conflation of all those things as an actual targeted campaign to create harm, right? And as I had sort of challenged myself to think through this in an organized way, and in the sort of like, and perhaps over intellectualized, but this is the way that I organize. How is this happening, and how does this fit into a larger, my computer keeps locking me out, so I'm logging back in so I can see us. How does this fit into a larger framework of smear campaigns, and how do smear campaigns fit into the sort of larger Zionist imprint in the context of the United States, and what we're seeing with the student intifada, and all the ways in which people are demonized and sort of silenced, is that these become ways in which settler colonialism, Zionist settler colonialism, in cahoots with American settler colonialism, is an expansionist project, right? And smear campaigns against academics, against dissidents, against people who take outward positions and refuse to sort of disconnect the work that we do from the political work that we do, whether that's in psychology or elsewhere, that these sorts of campaigns really are an arm of expansionism. And again, the synergy between the Zionist state and the United States is a logic of settler colonialism that has been talked about. Many people talk about this, of course. So it finds a fertile ground for that. But we're in a position now to be like, exactly everything that we said bore out. And I, not only did I not engage in all of this, but that it was an entirely a fabricated campaign to silence and to harm.
was there related to, well, first of all, congratulations, and people are,
Thank
sending you
you.
love in the chat. There was like, because I know the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter at GW has also faced a lot of harassment, I would describe it, by the university there. Was there also some stuff that came out around how GW needs to kind of conduct itself as well?
Yes. So this is a really important piece of this. Actually, in true Zionist fashion, Stand With Us was all, big and their breasts puffed out when the Department of Education took this out. And they have not said a fucking word about the fact that they were put in their place. This is how it works. The way that I learned about this was actually Palestine Legal. A month after Stand With Us had filed a complaint to the Department of Education against GW, Palestine Legal had filed a complaint on behalf of 3 students, saying that actually it was anti-Palestinian racism that GW had engaged in. And that's how I found out about the win, because that was the one, they were the ones who made a statement and a sort of press release around this. And interestingly, the other case by Stand With Us was included in this piece because they're so intimately involved, and some of the students were part of the program that I was in. That's now public information. I'm not saying anything new. And so these cases, the Department of Education, ironically, and this is the thing, sort of brought these 2 cases together and read them as being intimately involved, which they are, of course, and said that actually GW had engaged in anti-Palestinian racism, that they have a responsibility to Palestinians and Arabs on campus to be able to treat them fairly. And also one of the students who was, I believe, the president of the SJP chapter, the charges against him were dropped, and immediately with this filing, with this finding, and finally was able to clear sort of the disciplinary charges that was against him as well. So yeah, it came out very much so. And what I'll say is that I think the way that I understand it is that GW entered into an agreement, a preemptive agreement with the Department of Education, and no university does that unless you kind of know what the writing on the wall is, right? If you feel like there's evidence to the contrary, I think you would probably see this out. But there, and certainly on my side, there was ample evidence because you had the external investigation, you had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of documentation from me, but then also on the side of the students that were, again, involved in the same sort of, process, that there also was evidence that showed that it actually wasn't in the direction that Stand With Us or any one of these people were saying.
Thank you for all of that. And I mean, I think it's important for people to hear this because I know that there's a lot of people who have pending investigations like this or are in similar kinds of situations on their campuses. And I think it's important to affirm that, you can win these things, that there is, I mean, it's so blatantly obvious. Like when I did that piece and I included, I think, one of the GW's students from their SJP in it. Like it must have been like November of 2023. And like everybody's talking about anti-Palestinian racism on their campuses. Like that's the story. Like, I mean, like everybody you're talking about, like they're experiencing being profiled for wearing hijab, like all kinds of stuff like this, having, extra security follow them everywhere.
Yes.
And it's like, this is the real, like, if people want to think about a problem of racism and in real, like, racial oppression that's going on college, universities, and campuses, like this is the I mean, not saying it's the only target of that by any means, but Palestine was the issue that brought all of this, and it's even, I mean, we can kind of pivot with this too, because I think there's a lot obviously going on now with the Trump administration, with all of these now, kind of building in many ways off of what was going on with the Biden administration around all of this. But, the anti-immigrant stuff, the specific targeting of immigrants on college campuses and trying to get them, removed, trying to make it to where no student on a visa or something like that can protest in any way, which of course folks like Mamadou Tall and also Amanda Thomas Johnson, if I'm right, I think that's his name. We had him on years ago because he wrote a book, a little pamphlet called Becoming Kwame Ture, which is a great little read that covers the life of Kwame. He partly wrote it because there's so much about the way that Kwame Ture is treated that cuts out all of his life after his time in the United States to make it seem like kind of like, an afterthought, or when he lost his way or whatever. And he's like, no, this is because he's a militant Pan-Africanist, scientific socialist, and anti-Zionist. And it's particularly these things that, cause him to be. So anyways, Amanla, he's one of those, he just wrote a piece and I reached out to him about it about his experience at Cornell as well, because he was also there with Mamadou Tall. And he's also an immigrant student. I can't remember if he's from Senegal, I want to say, but maybe the UK by way of, and Trinidad originally. His father was a publisher in the UK, radical publisher.
Yep.
But
Yep.
anyway, there's there's all this targeting of that.
Yes.
There's also, obviously there's all the anti-DEI stuff, which is just so fascinating to me.
Yes.
Two Black said it very well. He said when a front loses its, I can't remember what he said, its effectiveness, or it serves its purpose, then it gets replaced.
Yes.
And I think that's a good way to think about this, of DEI as this kind of liberal, cooptative, counterinsurgent kind of thing, if we actually think about what the way it gets institutionalized on a lot of these places, right?
Yes.
And that being peeled away for just a more openly repressive,
Absolutely.
regime.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And obviously there's the war on trans folks, which is very real and going on across a lot of fronts right now. There's
Yes.
all these contradictions around this stuff. One of the things, I don't know, we start there.
Sure.
I know so we could also tell the story of your recent travel if you want to, which
I
is
will.
somewhat a reflection of this regime. So I don't know where we want to go with there.
Well, let me start first by saying, I want to shout out to the ADC, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, and Palestine Legal, who have been taking up these issues right, left, and center. And I do want to really say about the ADC as well, who just opened a crisis hotline and invite any students who are on visas and faculty as well to make contact with them around these issues. They're doing a Know Your Rights training. And I was recently in contact, the executive director was my lawyer. So I was recently in conversation with him, and I was asking him about, is this open to only Arabs, knowing what their answer was. But I'm clarifying this for folks to be able to pass the conversation. He's like, no, of course not. It's open to everybody who's been part of these protests and are now being threatened. And he basically said that almost like he said something around 80 to 90% of these students on visas are not Arabs, actually, which is a very important piece of the puzzle for us, right? This unity across these sort of solidarity struggles. And this is the difference, I think, between this movement and other movements, where trans and queer folk are a part of that, right? When people look and say, who are the people in the streets and what are the sort of solidarity struggles that are being mapped out, whether it's for undocumented folks or anti-imperialist or anti-capitalist, this is the thread that is being said. And yes, Palestine is the center of it. And certainly the genocide was all of that. But the rhetoric around it was very much an anti-capitalist sort of solidarity across the board. And that's why we see, for example, in Philly, when they're sort of talking about, gentrification and the sort of pushing out of Chinatown or any one of these places, that there's a Palestinian flag that's there because there's a recognition around these issues. And so I just kind of want to bring that to the forefront and also give props to the ADC for recognizing that as well. Like, this is not just an Arab issue. We know what is being targeted. And this is the ways also that universities have sort of mobilized the things they were never able to mobilize, just like a 9/11 moment happened where you could do all the things that you wanted to do as a regime and as a government that otherwise would not be okay. And you use 9/11 as a way to sort of, shoehorn like the Patriot Act and all these sorts of things and mass surveillance that you've probably had in place for a long time, but nobody was going to sign on to it. The same thing is happening. They're using Palestine as a way to get rid of labor organizers, to get rid of, trans folks, to get rid of conversations about reproductive rights or critical race theory. All this stuff was already being pressurized. And then you have Palestine open up, and it's such an easy way to be like, okay, now let's reconfigure the entire university and use this as the example, because everybody's going to be on board for that. And if we can talk about it in terms of anti-Semitism, then of course liberals are going to join and not have this a conversation about academic repression, because then all of a sudden they're just like, whoa, wait a second, I'm against academic repression, but not here, right? So that's a really important piece of this. And that's one of the ways in which we can connect all these things, all these fronts that people are now suddenly saying, oh, it's just, Trump that's doing this. it's really important for us to understand the infrastructure that was built and supported by Democrats and by liberals alike so that fascists can swoop in and mobilize these things. And we saw it happening through the Biden administration, but it predates that, of course, as well. And that's a really important, that's not a pedantic piece. That's not for us as leftists to just be like, have this position and be like, oh, they're one and the same. No, it's about us being clear about the structures and the infrastructure at place and who is needed for those to work. It can't just work when it's just a fact. Like, you guys have been playing into this game for a long time for it to now be able to be mobilized in this way. The level and the quickness and the swiftness of it under a fascist dictator, of course, we understand that. Yes. And we need to name that too. But none of this could be mobilized. And we can see now how this Trump 2.0, it had took these 4 years have been 4 years of planning so that you can turn that on right away. And we also know the Democrats did nothing, absolutely nothing. In fact, paved the way, handed them over, kind of what do they call it when you can just move into a house and it's ready to go, like a
turnkey.
Yeah, turnkey house. There you go, for fascism. That's precisely what we have in place, which is why these things are mobilized. And I can talk about my experience just 2 days ago, but did you want to say anything before then?
No, let's go talk about that now. Okay. Yeah.
So I think, I just landed in the United States 2 days ago, and I've been following everything that's happening, of course, with the ICE raids and knowing that these things are being mobilized. And so this is a sort of, PSA to everybody that no matter what your political positions are, I think recognizing the psychic sort of techniques that are involved with being in conversation with authority or cops or anything. So I made a point to, on the plane, read what my rights were as a green card holder. And study the language and know what it was. And I've never been more grateful for that, because I landed and I was asked immediately, and by the way, I have Canadian citizenship and I'm qualifying that. And we live in a world in which we have to qualify these things, but they're actually really important because the pretense to like added rights somehow get collapsed very quickly. I'm a green card holder. I have a Canadian citizenship. I'm coming in on that. And it doesn't matter, right? Because the question from the border police is, were you in Lebanon during this trip? And the answer also doesn't matter. No, I wasn't. Okay, you have extra immigration. All right. I'm asking the officer why, and they don't answer. I don't know, and walk me to a sort of secondary thing in which I was questioned by border police. And I want to sort of specify what the actual questioning was. Immediately when you're talking to border police, of course, you understand that all of that is a investigative sort of questioning that's happening. So remaining sort of aware of that process and the abuse of power, because there is no probable cause for anything. There's no reason. You just racially profiled me, and being clear about that. That was a racial profiling incident in which you asked me, have you been in Lebanon? I said no, but because it says I was born in Lebanon, despite the fact that I have a Canadian citizenship, I'm now put into secondary questioning. I had already let my lawyer know beforehand. He told me I'm here. Let me know when you've gotten through. So everybody was aware of this. And the questioning proceeded sort of just like trying to ask basic questions, things that people already know. I was in the United States as an immigrant, on a student visa. So that the information that I willfully answered are information that the United States government already has. But this is where it started to take a turn to see the fascism that's involved in this. Is at one point, they asked about the political significance of my tattoos. They searched everything in my bags, including looking through notebooks and seeing my notes and asking me about podcasts that I have been on, mentioning that I'm very active on social media and asking me about ACAB. And then the biggest thing, and this is the thing for folks to know, is at one point they pivoted and I asked them, I said, what's the purpose of this extra layer of questioning, because nobody has actually told me that. And one of them, there's sort of, two people involved, and they said, well, this is just luck of the draw. Whenever you come in, this might happen. And I said, well, I've been back and forth.
We just might ask you about podcasts. That's
right?
what we do.
Exactly. This is just completely normal conversation. That border police, and this is really important, right? Because we're in the habit of calling them Homeland Security because that's what their name is, but they are border police. And I think this is really important. In fact, that's what they said. You are here in conversation with border, you're on the border, and this is part of a security aspect. And I was, because I had refreshed myself about my right, I was like, no, that's actually not true. I know my rights, and I know what you're allowed to ask me about and what I have to respond to. And that has to do with my status and where I've been, just entry. All this other stuff, asking about political organizations, political organizing, anything. These are not questions that they are allowed to ask. And so telling a border police agent that you know your rights does not make them happy. And we know this from the ICE raids as well. And I think you can start to see the shift. And this is the part that I want to see. I shared this with my good friend and comrade and sister, Abi Sakatopoulou, who has this brilliant theory around exigent sadism and the ways in which that when we engage relationally, there's a way in which like your position as making your position known as antagonistic to the process actually rearranges the way the relationship proceeds. And this ties into some of the things I've been talking about, is that in that moment, we are meant, some of the things you and I have talked about, in that moment of questioning, we are meant to pretend that this is a completely normal process that's happening and there's nothing about power that's being unfolded. Now, those of us who are clued into this, we know that this is a lie from the very beginning, right? But the second you say, I refuse to respond to this and I know my rights, that makes it known. That positions you in an antagonistic relationship to that order and to the process that's happening. And you basically blow the lid off of the naturalness of this process. There actually is nothing natural about this happening. And this is a fascistic sort of show of power, right? So as soon as I said that, the ways in which they were engaging completely shifted, right? And then it was like, well, we can't actually compel you to answer these questions, but why not? This is part of a security process and you are at a border. And me having to sort of, again, the militant clarities repeat back and say, no, this is not part of a normal security process. This is what you're allowed to ask me. You can't ask me this. And then they shifted after that. And this is the part that I really want people to know. After that, they shifted and said, well, and part of the reason why we also do this is that there are clusters of people who like travel together and who have like relationships. And we really want to make sure that do you know these people or not? And then the border agent procured a list of names of people for me to identify and see if I'm actually in relationship with them, right? All of them were Arab names and presumably having to do with Palestine. And that was the moment that they were asking me to identify people, which again, one of the things is that, do I have to answer this question? No, we can't force you to answer this question. And me saying, I refuse to do that. I'm not going to do that. They asked me for my passcodes, for my computer, for my phone, again, refusing that, saying, no, you are not allowed access to my computer or my phone. You are allowed to do that, folks, that they don't have the right to do that as a citizen or as a green card holder. You are protected against that. You can refuse them to do that, but you have to actually say these things out loud to acknowledge that this is what's happening and to name it. Again, we've talked about this before about how power is meant to function without being named, right? That this abusive relationship is meant to sort of be secretive. And the second that you name it, also activates a responsibility in them to name what they are doing, right? No, I can't compel you. No, I can't do this. But yeah, this is the world we're in right now, right? And one of the scary things is to think about this border police agent had these names ready, right? This person was with me the entire time. So these names were prepared beforehand. I don't know if it's like tracking who's coming on these flights or whatever. Everything is believable right now, but to sort of know that this is the world where these are not abstractions when we talk about who's targeted and who are the people who are harassed and who are the people that are racially profiled. And this happened 2 days ago, right? And I was able to talk to my lawyer afterwards, and they really don't know if this is a one-time thing or that every time that I come into the country that this is going to be what happens. But I really want folks to know. And then before I left, before they quote unquote released me, the border agent said, "You sure are really active on social media. And I looked you up. And do you really believe ACAB?" And I said, "I don't have to answer that question."
No, you're the good one.
Well, that was the position. You had a good experience with us, right?
Right.
Again, that was literally what they said. You had a good experience with us, right? And that's the thing about like normalizing things that are actually not normative, right? This interaction was a moment of racial profiling. This interaction actually had no reason to happen, and it's politically motivated, and it's specifically targeting dissidents and activists, and we know who they are. This is not arbitrary either about who they're asking about, who they're targeting. And this is, I think, the sort of what I mean by a turnkey state that you've given these fascists. Yes, they're acting with impunity, but this impunity didn't come out of nowhere.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, as many people said, it's like if the Democrats, I think we talked about this before during the elections, like if the Democrats actually believed that Trump was a fascist, like the Democratic Party, if they
Yes.
believed this, then they would have been destroying all of the state records and things like this before
Yes.
they were handing over power. Like if you're actually believe that fascists are now taking power, then as somebody who's actually anti-fascist, you have a duty to then do whatever you can to disrupt their ability to be effective. And instead it's like, no, like here's everything, like, most most of the same people are working in the same jobs. They may be more frustrated in them, etc., but like, obviously there's all the appointees and all the people
Yes.
who take new positions and so on when you have changes in power in the state. But most of the bureaucracies are the same, which is also part of why Trump and Elon Musk and all these folks are now targeting to slash a lot of these bureaucracies, because
Yes.
they want to be able to throw out all of these people who have been working in government
Yeah.
for a long time, and they don't think will be as pliant to their agenda as they would like.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And this is the thing. I'm just one last thing about DEI. I wrote a piece a while ago called Diversity Efforts as Stabilizing Colonialism, right? Because, and Angela Davis had said this, just like DEI is just a corporate strategy and becomes synonymous. I think Sarah Ahmed said this, becomes synonymous with sort of, with justice, when it's really not. It's not about it's shifting structure. It's not about everything. It's about kind of, and shout out to Black, who always says things way, way more eloquently than I could. But the sort of systems are willing to expand and include everybody and co-opt everybody until they can't handle that anymore. And then they clap down really quickly. And that's what we're saying, because the logical extensions, if you really wanted to extend it to the point in which it does, that it can't handle that. The structure can't handle that because it's constitutively not meant to handle that. And if you really wanted to confront issues of white supremacy, you wouldn't be doing it through diversification efforts or, representational politics or any one of these things. So when the demands actually become larger than what it was actually meant to do, it is going to clamp down and shut down. But also, I want to sort of invite us that I'm not trying to say that we know the research around this. The DEI efforts primarily actually helped out white folks, right? That all the sort of proposed ideas about what DI could do never came to be, precisely because the structure itself was rotten to begin with and was never going to shift more than that, but allow people and structures to be like, yay, pat on the back, this is what I'm doing all that, but nothing really changed in terms of power and structure, right? And also, I think it's really important for us to do away with all the pretense. When you have the FBI, right? We saw this photo of somebody like painting over the FBI something about diversity. I'm just like, what space does that have in the FBI? And us thinking that is a representation of like justice or progress or any one of these things. I think doing away with all the pretense and all the spaces. And this goes, I know we're going to talk a little bit about George Jackson sort of saying that rage is sort of put into empty places to demobilize people. That's precisely it. That any DEI efforts that are, and I'm not saying this pedantically, that are built on stolen land and on the backs of enslaved people, and you think that this is going to be the thing that fixes that, was already doomed to the get-go. And so the sooner we can say that's the fucking lie that it always was, and this is not a replacement for justice, the better. And that is not, just because it's like, no, we should have always been saying this, because we know, those of us who are in institutions under these sort of, DI did nothing. I filed a complaint with the DI office just to go through every single process that there was, and that didn't do anything. In fact, they were engaged when this report came out, and you can see all the things that GW did. It included all the things wasn't even privy to this. The things they did to bend over backwards to throw me to the wolves included the DEI office, and we know.
Yeah, no, I mean they are like they're the diversified cops on campus, like administration, right? It's like that's I mean, I think about all the, like, during the student intifadas and stuff like that, like all of the way, like that, those were the people that got sent out to the encampments to say, hey, you want to come meet with us? Like, this is what we had talked about, like the refusing these fake gestures and bringing you into the room for the like feel good conversation and stuff like that. I mean, and yeah, I mean, and I say that as somebody who's known people who have worked in these structures and tried to do subversive things with them and so on, but also like very honest about what their work was over time. But also on that note, did I have something else that I wanted to take you back on? I can't remember what I was going to say. We can go to George, because George, I think, helps us talk about this more. I mean, one of the things I do want to say that you, I think, hinted at too is, when we think of, first of all, shout out to also Dylan Rodriguez, who has done a lot of great work around DEI and what he has called multiracial white supremacy, which I think is a great construct that he's done. And I'm interested in talking to him too about how he's reading this moment and this shift, because he's been so, militantly clear, I would say, about naming what it is that DEI efforts are actually intended at doing, and really looking at how the language, if you read the counterinsurgency field manual of our government, that it's all about DEI, essentially. That it's all about like representation and funneling people into official institutions and making them feel like they can vote for things, and and all this branding and creating leaders within communities that you don't want to join insurgent formations and so on. And so anyway, I think that's important to say, and I would love to talk to him more about this shift. I guess, one of the things that you made me think of too is the discussion right now around like the defunding of US aid, or the absorption of US aid directly into the State Department. Again, if you read the counterinsurgency field manual, it's quite clear that US aid is like the primary state organ to do development activities that are designed to, crush revolutionary uprisings. And, as we know through the history of this organization, it's also very often just a front where then CIA people are actually in it and doing really crazy stuff through it. And so, this is one of the things, it's like, that's one of the things in this moment where there's so much kind of slash and burn going on with all these government institutions, where we also have to be like, okay, we need to be really clear on the fact that there are people who are going to be harmed by these decisions, and how do we figure out how we're going to support, work with, build with people that are going to be harmed by a lot of these decisions, but also understanding that the institutions themselves, some of them quite clearly are really bad, and other ones that we often think of as like good are also full of what we could call carceral workers or whatever, like, and so Yeah, I mean, it's like I think it's a complicated moment in that way because liberals in this moment, their impulse is to sort of say everything that Trump does bad. So he's getting rid of US aid. I love US aid. Or he's going to defund the FBI's diversity and inclusion office. Like, we need to fight for that, and like
Right.
on one level, I think I agree with you where it's like, no, it's actually, I think, better that we're clear
Yes.
that hey, I don't need the USAID branding on the State Department and the CIA. I don't need the DEI brand. I don't need the FBI to send out the Martin Luther King tweet every year
Yeah.
after they helped to, were a part of his killing.
Yes.
Um, and certainly about a part of like all this counterinsurgency against him. And so,
Yeah.
there's a one part of it where it's like you're more clear, and then at the same time, like there are a lot of real people in different places if they
Yes.
work for universities or
Yeah.
school districts or whatever that are going to be impacted by these decisions,
Yep.
and like it's just a difficult space, I think, because
Of course.
the natural impulse is just to be like kind of not of a lot of people is to be kind of reactionary defensive of
Yeah.
things that we don't really need to defend as institutions,
Right.
but then
Yes.
there's the people element of it
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, of course. And here's the thing is that I would ask, these are the moments I think you and I very early on in these conversations talked about the ways in which these liberal humanist discourses lodge inside of us. And we even forget that they're there and they're at play, right? That we believe in a rights-based discourse, that we believe in international law. And then we get like shocked every time. These moments, like you're saying, I would invite people, these are beautiful moments for us to really dig deep and see where these things still act inside of us. That when your impulse is to protect US aid, right? That you can see what's at play and what is internalized very deep in you, whether that's about American exceptionalism or empire or the role of that. Because the ask there is not to forget the people that are being, impacted by this, but to ask, who are the people who've always been impacted by this and you never thought about them, right? And that's the piece really to say, like, whoa, how does this all of a sudden, these people become, you register, these people are being impacted, whereas the entire project of USAID is a big swath of people in the world being impacted by US imperialism, and you didn't give a fuck about that before, right? That's a moment for us to be like, whoa. And this is not a shaming comment. This is a place really for us to explore further the psychopolitical affective space in which propaganda and American empire and American exceptionalism gets internalized entirely and then mobilized in these ways, so that now we're made to make this impossible choice. Save the people that are sort of being impacted by this decision because it comes from Trump. We don't need to make that impossible choice. We need to say, what are the ways in which this entire structure was, a project of empire that could never have gone well if you really are an anti-imperialist. And that's the place. Are you anti-imperialist or not? And I think that is a position for us to reckon with. Like, what does it mean to be anti-imperialist? What does it mean to be anti-capitalist? Means we're really confronted with the things that need dismantling, with the things that are going to be left behind, with some of the wagers that are made to really commit to that, right? And this is part of it. But like you were saying, is like, that doesn't mean that if these people that are impacted by this, what does it mean to then say, okay, this is what people power means? Like, if you can be left stranded on a USAID mission at any moment, that was always an imminent potential by this state. But along the way, somehow you had, implanted purposeful amnesia about the purpose of this and how it actually was and what your position was in this. Because I want to draw a parallel here. You know that there's a thing called Israel aid as well, right? And that when you see these propaganda, it's easy for us to see those propaganda photos and see how Israel goes into spaces, especially after natural disasters and sort of thing, and make everybody in those places, usually on the African continent, wear Israel flag t-shirts and take photo ops and do all these things and say this is Israel aid. The US aid is not any different, right? And our sort of ability to see that clearly but not see this is a function of US exceptionalism and a disavowal that the US empire is a settler colonial empire, and one that uses all levers of soft power and hard power and brute power and all the sort of things to make its presence known and to have its hand on regional sort of politics. And there's nothing innocent about any of that. Right. And so I really actually think it's a moment for us to be like, okay, this thing has this reaction in me. Let me sort of look at that and see what's up with that. How am I still having this reaction?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think that's great. I appreciate that. Couple comments. Wonder how the CIA is handling being stripped of one of their tools, USAID. Maybe it's run its usefulness and they have other plans now. Somebody brought up that USAID has been instrumental in Haiti for sure. I mean, I think this is the thing, like that's to go back to Two Black's comment again. It's like when a front outlives its, its purpose or its usefulness, then it gets replaced by a new one. And I think that it, for a Biden administration, those fronts were still useful, right? For the Trump administration, it causes too many contradictions between the way that they want to move to have some of these things. And so that does, I think, key us that they're going to be moving differently.
Yes.
But it again, like, it's just like, resist that urge to have nostalgia for these things. It's like it's just a different branding on US imperialism. It's not and so, and I think in some ways, again, like, to use those examples used with Israel aid, etc., like, those types of institutions have been effective in certain ways, in certain instances of bringing people in and thinking like, oh, well, these people actually helped us, or this, and that's what they're intended to do. I mean, the US government in its counterinsurgency field manual is quite clear that, like, the purpose of US aid is to help us be effective in fighting something like the Palestinian resistance or the Lebanese resistance or whatever, So anyway.
Listen, there's a personal story behind this. I went to the American University of Beirut and I got a scholarship from USAID. I didn't get to choose who gave me the scholarship. The university gave me, and part of every year what I had to do was write a letter of thank you to the United States government about helping educate the little, the little natives and in this sort of way. And it was always, I recognized, so it's not only that I'm here to civilize you, it's that now you must be grateful also that I am doing this, right? Because if it really were just this sort of altruistic thing, why the fuck is an undergraduate student writing a thank you letter to Empire about this? And it was always so conflictual for me. I'm like, what do I write about? So I ended up sort of doing snarky things like, thank you for funneling the resources you could have helped your own citizens with to help me. Like, how do you justify that?
Wow, that I did not know that. That's great. That just adds another. I'm so appreciative too that you understood what that was even then, and that you have your clarity. But that's a perfect example too of what we're talking about, right? Because it's like a bribe, right? It's like they're betting on, if we do this with enough people, that we're gonna draw in people who are be like, hey, USAID gave me that scholarship. I wouldn't be where I am today without that, and it's the same thing when people talk about, like, the Ford Foundation, grants and scholarships, etc. Like, these are I bring that in because Dylan also talks about that with regard to counterinsurgency and so on too. So no, appreciate that. That's great. We have somebody in the chat whose dad went to UAB or AUB.
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Oppressive Contract. So we just finished up the Blood in My Eye study group this past week. The last two sections that we read, one was the eulogy from Huey P. Newton. The other is this final letter that George Jackson wrote. I don't know if it's the last thing he wrote, but it's the last thing he wrote that's published in Blood in My Eye. And it was written just a couple weeks before he was killed. And it's called The Oppressive Contract. And I have some things I've written down about it. I think I'll give some of the quotes of how he describes it. So one, I mean, I read it as like this is, it's a play on the idea of a social contract, right, which goes into sort of liberal thinking around the relationship of citizens to the state and so on. Um, but he's thinking about it particularly in the United States. And so he writes, he calls the oppressive, or he describes the oppressive contract as, quote, coercive conformity and indulgent flexibility to the demands of hierarchy.
I love that line.
He says that we must understand, quote, both the economic motives and the psychosocial motives which perpetuate the oppressive contract. And he says the principal contradiction of monopoly capital's oppressive contract is that the system produces outlaws. It also breeds contempt for the oppressed. Accrual of contempt is its fundamental survival technique.
Mm-hmm.
This leads to the excesses and destroys any hope of peace eventually being worked out between the two antagonistic classes, the haves and the have-nots. Coexistence is impossible, contempt breeds resistance, and resistance breeds brutality. The whole growing in spirals that must either end in the uneconomic destruction of the oppressed or the termination of oppression. That's a quote. So as we I mean, obviously, also as we read it, I mean, I'm going to share some reflections from people in the group, but they said, look, he's talking about imperialism here, and he's talking about um, the position you get in when you draw your spoils, your wages,
Yeah.
your bag from imperialism, and that and thinking about this, like he's thinking about white workers in this instance, and about how the problems, in that book he has this sharp critique all the way through of the labor movement in the United
Yep.
States, and the way that the labor movement, always at key moments, basically lines up in this kind of national chauvinistic way of being about itself and not being internationalists, not being anti-racist, and so on. Obviously he's writing in 1971. And so, I think one of the interesting things to think about in terms of the oppressive contract, although he does touch on it in terms of figures within the Black community who align themselves with it, essentially, is how much more diverse the group of people who kind of buy into the oppressive contract might be now
Mm-hmm.
than it was in 1971, in which a lot of times these oppressive forces were clearly white and clearly white
Yep.
dominated.
Yep.
Um, but he was seeing, it wasn't to him just strictly white. He did see that within the Black community, which he's primarily talking about, that there were certain people who were aligning themselves with these forces already.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, uh that's one thing, and I think I bring this up because there's also among a lot of liberal folks right now, you see these takes of like, well, I don't care about the anti-ICE rallies. Like, those people got what they deserved because they supported Trump, right? Which is just like nonsense on multiple levels, of course. But like, these things are being said, right? There's even like jokes that certain people are
I
making
know.
about calling ICE on people and things like this, right? And I'm not talking about, reactionary. I mean, they are reactionaries, but I'm not talking about Republicans, for
Right.
instance, doing this.
Right.
Um, and then there's yeah, just a lot of, there's also the whole thing, especially with Palestinians or Arabs, of this idea that, you all didn't show up for Kamala
Right.
despite the fact that she's carrying out a genocide,
Right. Right.
and so this is what you get. It's okay. I saw this the other day when the plans of Trump of, saying, oh, I'm gonna
Yes.
ethnically cleanse it, saying, well, what did you think was going to happen? This is what we told you.
Right.
And so there's all of that, and then there's also, yeah, this thing too of people responding as Trump rolls out all these different executive orders that target, and they're like, oh, maybe that one's actually going to impact me now.
Right.
And then that's the moment at which they get activated, which, like, on one level, if you're activated, great, like, let's get you, but it's also like some reflection on, like, why did it take it to get to that point?
Right.
And, now you need to also think about showing up for everybody else too, and not just yourself.
Right.
So anyways,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
I
I mean, part of the brilliance of somebody like George Jackson or any one of these folks, number one, is that, remember, he was a Black revolutionary, but he was a political prisoner. And I think that's really important, because these are the folks that, whether from Turtle Island to Palestine, political prisoners have always included the psychological realm as part of their revolutionary structure. And this is the piece that sort of stands out to me, that if you read from Walid Daqa to Cabral to Asara Shakur to anybody who are talking about this thing, to Mumia's positions, any one of these things, that they understand that the realm of the psychic is central to the ways in which power works. And I think the forgetting of this is to quell the revolutionary aspect, where you can understand that the psychic province is ripe to be intruded upon. And part of it is to, of course, have people identify with power. This is, I think, what part of what George Jackson also is saying with this sort of oppressive contract, is like there needs to be an identification that happens. And that identification is primarily around issues of supremacy and sort of hoarding of resources, to be able to create differentials between people and have them forget or unsee or unlink, right, what the system is doing to them as a unified front. Right. And that, of course, is mobilized through race in the context of the United States. I think this is part of it. So that's number one, is to say, like, I'm just struck over and over again when I read these revolutionary writers about how clear they are about the psychic realm. The other piece is, I think I've started to gauge the brilliance of these thinkers and these revolutionaries and why they were targeted, right? Why they were murdered, why they were, targeted by the state, is if we can pick up a book from, or a passage from 1971 and feel like it's speaking to the moment right now, there's a way in which you recognize the truth that is central to their words, right? And most of that is hard won. These insights are hard won because many of them are writing from within prison walls. Many of them are writing as recipients of state violence, as people who have been tracked and hunted. Like, when I hear Mumia and his clarity, I'm just like, this inside out, because you know how the state moves, and you know that there's no such thing as justice and fairness and all that. And therefore, you're able to speak to it with such clarity and such focus and such militancy. It's unbending, which is the same thing as Frantz Fanon. It's again, Asada, when you see the hyper clarity of this, it's really a reminder for us, that they're able to cut across time, is because they're talking about structures. They're not individualizing it. They're not being sort of confounded by a temporal space. They're communicating to us the way that structures move and recalibrate themselves. And it might have a different face and a different way of resonance, or a different way of making itself known. Certainly, we've seen the increase of the violence of the state over the course of 40 years, let's say 50 years, the militarization of police, all this sort of. I'm not saying it's the exact same way, but when you think about the logic of power and the way they were speaking to that, that is precisely what I'm sort of thinking about when I read George Jackson, is being like, holy shit, like, you are really the structure inside out. And that's why you're able to sort of speak about it in this way and have a sort of alert to it, which in many ways, when I was thinking about it, when you start to talk about DEI, he's also talking about that when he was talking about assimilation, right? Assimilation is normalization, is sort of, I've thought about Glenn Coulthard's Redskin White Masks and how he actually advocates for what he calls disciplined resentment. Like, Indigenous people have to consistently engage in a process of disciplined resentment, because if you are not disciplined in your resentment, you will be seduced into normalization of the settler colonial condition and forget. And I think George Jackson's saying the same thing, right? Is like, there are all these ways in which the state, like you're saying, counterinsurgency manuals, are going to invite you in, and it's going to feel like somehow you're getting something, or that this is going to be a fix for all the ills and all the sort of struggles that your ancestors went through, and this is the payment and this is the payoff. And it's just like, that shit's not doing anything. In fact, it's actually making you a danger to your comrades, because what that sets up, like DEI, like this assimilative process, this, I think he called it coercive conformity, right? Is disciplining you. And in doing that, you are setting up a dichotomy of good subject, bad subject. And we know this, the good subject, the good Black person, the good Arab are the ones who will be docile and go through DEI and join organizations and join boards, and you make reform from inside and you do all of that. And so you're actually joining in the processes of the state and configuring who is a good subject and who's not. Because guess who's not? Anybody who's militant and revolutionary and disruptive and committed to direct action and recognizes and states out loud and names that all this shit is actually part of the machinations of a surveillance state and a police state, right? The seduction into that and the identification. And I'm just, rereading, I'm just struck by that. Like, it's just unbelievable. And every time I'm like, I want people to sit with these texts and sort of read them as comrades, as much as sort of thought leaders that we can learn from, but really as comrades. What would it be like to be sitting in a conversation with a comrade who's kind of laying this out for you?
Yeah, I'm gonna share like a small little section here on the screen. So yeah, there's a part I'm going to read that comes before this, but he's dealing with a separate topic. But this is the oppressive contract that he talks about, and he says, "Then my thoughts turned the oppressive contract in general. It's the nature of cancer to expand. You've seen a great deal of it firsthand. U.S. expansionism since World War II. I've only studied it vicariously, but we see the same conclusions. Millions of outlaws in the Union of South Africa, Jordan, Indochina, and here, summary executions, not of uniformed soldiers, but ordinary people, first women and children in a ditch in Vietnam, ultimately execution in the civic centers of every look-alike county in this country." And yeah, I mean, again, like it obviously brings up Gaza and all of that, as well as it talks about women and children in the ditch. But this is the thing, and it's obviously not new, I mean, and that's the important thing. And it's interesting because George, as we talked about in our study group with that book, he deals so much with the 20th century and is really, really good on the 20th century. But actually, I think a lot of, you go back to Gerald Horne's work and many others. I mean, so many of the things that he's talking about actually just are very much through lines of the entire history of the settler colonial projects, as well as with slavery and so on. And I appreciate the analysis that George brings to that within the 20th century. But yeah, it's like, because this was one of the debates, and because he has this great analysis of fascism within the United States. But at the same time, and people in the class were pushing of sort of, well, when does it become fascists? Does it really become fascist in the 20th century? And I think that there, on the one hand, George is really analyzing fascism from a 20th century context. So from Italy, from Germany, from the United States in this period, and it as a specific phase in the development of monopoly capitalism, as a way of maintaining and ensuring class rule, basically, by the capitalists. Which I think is very instructive for people to read now and to think about this moment, right, as thinking about it as a kind of particular type of management structure of our authoritarian capitalist state, imperialist state. But on the flip side, I do think that there is a lot that can be pulled in of the history of settler colonialism and slavery, and showing the ways in which what we think of as the fascistic elements
Hmm.
have always been here, right? And
Hmm.
so it's not something
Hmm.
that becomes new in the 20th century, even if there might be a specific kind of political development that we might think of around fascism in that
Right,
time.
right. Um, it to that point about like how and how it stabilizes, right? Can you pull up that quote where he says that the system sort of is intent on having revolutionary rage be directed into
Yeah,
empty assets?
let me see if I can find it real quick.
Because it's
The
a
other thing I just wanted to mention while I'm pulling that up is um that there, as you're reading this, there's also a crossover to Basil al-Araj in
yes,
terms of the system producing outlaws,
yep,
which he talked about in that quote, but he also talks about before of revolution will not be tolerated. It is against the law in the totalitarian corporative state. Um, and the revolutionary must reconcile himself with one day becoming an outlaw. And
yeah,
this, of course, Basil has this piece that he wrote called Exiting Law, Entering Revolution, where he deals with this same thing. And I thought that was really, really
yeah,
interesting that they both,
and it
um,
puts into focus what you and I were talking about before, right? Is like, oh, this is, are you an anti-imperialist? And when you commit to that, what does it mean? And what are the sort of risks that come with that? Right? What are the sort of, which might include getting stopped by border agents, or might include, but losing a visa, or might include having disciplinary action. But these students showed us that they knew what they were like. This is the wager I was talking about. Like, but that's the point of the commitment. Or when we see people, Palestine action activists in the UK, they're very clear on what the sort of outcome might be, and they're just like, and that's the point, is like, the point in some ways is also to force the hand of the state to do its violence as we know it does, in with complete and utter clarity, because this is happening whether or not. And then the wager, the personal wager, is like, these are the risks I'm willing to take if I'm sort of committing to this, right? And I think this is the piece that I'm saying that
yeah. So
goes
he
into
says
what you're saying.
he says the artless, empty appeals of the pseudo nation, love and respect for a flag, a nationalist song or beat, the fervent belief in a bond or organization which arises out of a thwarting longing for real community. He's talking about faux U.S. nationalism, which we'll see a lot of this week tomorrow at the Super Bowl. By the way, and go Birds, of course. But yes, and the establishment does everything in its power to ensure that revolutionary rage is redirected into empty outlets which provide pressure releases for desires that could become dangerous if allowed to progress.
And
And
that's
he says,
DEI.
yeah. And he says at this stage in the development of monopoly capitalism, there are two alternatives: aggressive revolutionary activity or calcification. Conservative society, black or white, is decadent society. Due to the absence of creativity and movement, conservative society always burns itself out. So,
That's right. Exactly.
yeah.
And that's the thing that I want to see, that establishes everything in its power to redirect revolutionary rage into empty aspect. And that's what we were talking about. If you think about, again, and you go back, I'm not the only person who says this, when we talk about DEI as sort of effectively, making a split, forcing a split between, potential actions, and then that gets channeled. That's where all your rage gets channeled into. Well, you're taking people offline, you're demobilizing people. And in fact, those people who then get into that cycle or feel like they're being represented in some way, then act as the cops against people who do have revolutionary rage. And they're like, you're disrupting our ability to make progress. You're the one, which is what we're seeing, to your point, what we're seeing when people start saying, well, you're the ones who did this. You're the one. And let's face it, let's be honest. It's Kamala supporter, resentful Kamala supporters who are saying this. But that's the point of the empty channeling of that. Like, at least that's who's then positioned, and you make pariahs out of people who actually are committed to revolutionary rage for a multitude of reasons, not the least of which is that they're not disalienated from the source of their suffering. right? Or think that somehow having it, just by virtue of it being a Black woman in the face of empire, is going to change anything for anybody, not the least of which is Black folks, right? That people being unwilling to subject themselves to, or to assimilate, or to engage in the competitiveness of racism. This is the other thing that he says, where the psychosocial effect of competitiveness and racism then become the target of people who are unwilling to actually be honest about what it is that you really are upset about. Right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think he does talk about the competitiveness of racism, and that's one of the things within the oppressive contract that I appreciated about what he's articulating, is that, like, he even talks about, he has this section about Black men and Black women too, and their need to be unified and so on. And, people were in the class talking about that and saying, like, gosh, like, he's nailing something that is still something that is this debate that we're dealing with, and so, like, all of those ways that a kind of neoliberal identitarian kind of politics tries to create these, like, smaller and smaller slices that
Yes.
somehow, like, my oppression is the only one, that,
Yes.
rather than, like, how do we thread these things together? How do we be meaningfully in solidarity and recognize that your oppression is also, I mean, I will say this is a random thing, but Laverne Cox, who was on CBS This Morning like a couple weeks ago, and the clip might be hard to find because I'm sure CBS This Morning was very unhappy with what she had to say, which was, they were talking to her about, like, how do we show up for trans folks in this moment. And she talked about, of course it's very difficult, all the stuff's going on, like, we're under attack, like, no doubt. And she was like, we're all workers, we need to unite. And, I mean, and it was like, and she was like, and the strikes should have taught us that. Like, she's talking about, like, all the Hollywood strikes and all this stuff. And it was great. It was like a very, like, it was such a refreshing thing. Whereas, like, this moment where they're actually hoping that she's going to sort of play into some kind of agenda, right? Where it would be like, oh, like, you just need to show up for us and, like, do this. And, like,
Right.
she's like, no, like, we all need to come together and
Workers
fight
of the
this thing
world
together.
unite.
And it's like, and she's like, it is, she literally said, like, we need to fight the people who own the means of production, and, like, all of this, and I think that's great. And that's what, that's what George is saying too, is like that, he's talking about, like, how is it that you're getting screwed.
Yeah.
Right? He's talking white workers here, right?
Right.
He's like, how is
Right.
it that you're getting screwed by this system,
Right.
and yet you're still fighting to defend this
Yeah.
system? And I think that's the thing that, like, people really need, is like, there's very few people that are actually really, really benefiting in this thing.
Absolutely.
There's others of us who are invested in it, right?
Yes.
And that investment is economic, it's psychic, it's social, right? And that's where he gets to those pieces, like you said, bringing those things together of, like, even as somebody who is, like, militantly in this book Marxist, like, militantly, openly calls himself communist
Yeah.
throughout it, right? And is very much talking about the economic contradictions and political economy throughout it. But he's like, we also really got to understand these psychosocial aspects of it if we really want to be successful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My computer locked me out again. I don't know why it keeps doing that. It's just like, stop being engaged in this. Maybe that's the messaging around it. No,
this is what they secretly did to your computer when you were going through.
Right when it was there, right? This and my computer, by the way, remember, has "This Machine Kills Fascists" on it. So,
yeah.
on it, so it was sitting there. It was a great target for this. But yeah, I think this is the piece, right? And I think, you and I think several conversations ago, I think it was around Kamala and electoral politics and stuff like that, where, like, the ask was for us to be honest about the ask was to identify as American first and use race as a way to mobilize that, right? That was the excuse about, like, an empty identitarian politics. These are the empty, outlets that I think George is talking about. These are empty outlets around identity politics that folks like the Combahee River Collective had told us already.
Are we going to be fighting over what Target does around, the businesses that they let in their store and their DEI branding and what the
Right.
pride thing looks like? Like, is that the fight for?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Or the fight for, who belongs in the military. Like these are misguided fights around this, because we should be saying actually the military is a conduit towards violence that can never be actually inclusive, quote unquote, in these ways, and the over focus on that. This is the coercive conformity, I think, around it. But yeah, I think these are the places for us to sort of push up against and really recognize what is happening, what we're being drawn into, what we're being asked to make decisions about, what's deflective, where our energy goes, and what does that stabilize and what does it demobilize, right? And defang. And really, it's not, accidental. Do you hear my dog agreeing with me?
Yeah, he's fired up. Yeah.
He knows.
Right on.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. This has been great. Is there anything else that you wanted to kind of touch on or talk about or shout out right now? Or
I don't think so, folks.
yeah. What's up with your book? How's your book going?
Oh, it's good. It's not coming out this year because, as you can imagine, writing has been quite difficult. But it's slated, I think, for the beginning of next year, and I'm making progress is all I can say. And just, I mean, you can imagine that the focus of it has also really shifted. Like I'm using material from the last year, and that's part of it, is sort of like, how does this reconfigure it? Because it's called From the Clinic to the Streets, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures. And I'm talking about the ways in which we can despecialize these psychic processes for all of us to use it as one of many revolutionary tools. And this is precisely it, is like, how do we center the reading of psychic processes? Many of the conversations you and I have had of like, we read processes as they unfold as a way to actually arm ourselves. It's a weapon in being able to know precisely and be able to locate and distill the psychological as a part of this, and then to sort of turn around and say, okay, this is one of many revolutionary. It can't be the only thing, right? I'm not arguing for rehabilitation of psychoanalysis as a mode of, as the only mode or a cultish way of sort of thinking about it, but rather saying there's something that these militants knew and these political prisoners always know about the psychological realm. And is there a way to sort of use these examples and distill it and put it in language that actually people can use and mobilize and recognize? Because the number of, this is the other piece that I'm, and by the way, shout out to Pluto. They've been amazing. And my editor, David Shulman, who's wonderful and understands that like this moment, actually, there was a lot that we needed to include about this moment. And so their patience has been wonderful around that. But really the number of like organizations and organizers and all of that would reach out and be like, can we want to be in conversation around what we are up against psychologically and the intrusions, and how do we sort of handle, and like people get it. And I think there's a moment in which like we know there's like the pop psychology moment in which everybody's just like, everybody needs a therapist, or everything is a form of gaslighting or is a form of trauma. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about us also being able to take up these these principles that became highly specialized, right, except in the arms of the state, because we know also psychoanalysts have a long sorted history with working with the state. And right now, with the anti-trans bills, they're primarily psychoanalysts who are providing them with the language around this and all of that. So the counterforce needs to be to despecialize this expertise and actually mobilize it in service of revolution. So I will keep you posted, comrade, around that. It's moving. I hope
Awesome.
it'll be done soon.
You know what? There was one other thing. Did you see that clip and it was from an old podcast, but I hadn't watched the whole thing. It was the one Yasin Bey, also known Mos Def, he had done an interview, where he had said, like, are we seeing the decline of empire? Is that what? And he had his whole thing about Drake and all that. But there was a moment in it that I saw on Instagram. I wonder if I could pull it up really quick.
Yeah, I don't think I saw this.
Yeah, it was great because it was like, I was like, this is Lara right here. Let's see. All right, let me see if I can pull it up real quick. Yeah. All right. Try to share this. All right. All right, hang on. Where is this? What? How do I make the? Yeah.
Does it say up there the original audio?
Oh, there we go.
Society, it means that you are healthy. I am mourning for all of us, but also I can't embrace despair, even though it sometimes feels very attractive and sensible to do so. I know it's heartbreaking. You should be heartbroken. That means your heart is working. If you're heartbroken and it's distressing, that means that you are sane. You are a functioning individual. If you are uncomfortable and you're maladjusted to a sick society, it means that you are healthy. I am mourning for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now we got it all. Yeah. So anyways, it just reminded me of conversations we've had in the past of just like, this, I think this came out, I feel like it did come out after October 7th last year. So it's like he's talking about Gaza, he's talking about everything else. But yeah, I mean, I think that and I think he's talked about Sudan and
Right.
Congo and a bunch of other things in that interview. But yeah, it just was like, I was like, that's what you've always said is like, if you feel crazy right now, like, kind of hold on to that. Like it means that you're sane.
Yes. Yeah. And your heartbreak is a sign also of being attuned to life and life worlds that are out there, rather than this alienation that George Jackson is talking about.
Yeah.
Don't conform. That's what I'll say.
Right
and
on.
know your
All right.
rights on borders, folks.
Know your rights on borders. Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been great. Look forward to doing it again. It will not be 4 months or 3 months next time. So we'll do this again soon, folks.
Always
Thanks,
a pleasure.
everybody.
Thank you.
Always a
Thanks,
pleasure.
everyone.
Yeah, thank you.